in the heart of Blackwood Creek, a town cradled by ancient forests and perpetual mist. Old stories don't just fade away, they linger, like the damp chill in the air. For generations, the townsfolk have whispered a name in hushed tones, a name that belongs to the darkness, the midnight ghost. They say it's the restless spirit of a soul wronged, a specter that wanders the cobbled streets only when the clock tower strikes 12, searching for something it lost long ago. Most people treat it as a local legend, a scary story to tell around a bonfire. But for Emily, it was more. She wasn't a native of Blackwood Creek. She had moved there seeking quiet, a refuge from the clamor of the city. She bought a small, secluded house on the edge of town, right where the dense woods began to swallow the last of the street lights. It was in the dusty attic of this old house, tucked away in a forgotten chest, that she found a collection of old journals. The leather-bound books belonged to the house's previous owners, and they were filled with frantic, terrified entries about the midnight ghost. The journals described a tall, shadowy figure with no discernible face, a presence that brought an unnatural cold and a profound sense of sorrow. It didn't scream or rattle chains. Its horror was in its silence, its unnerving stillness. It would appear at the foot of the bed, stand in a dark corner, or watch from just beyond the window pane. The diarists wrote of sleepless nights, of a creeping madness that followed the sightings. They weren't just stories, they were warnings. Instead of being terrified, Emily was fascinated. The loneliness of the small town had started to weigh on her, and this mystery felt like a purpose. She began her own investigation, spending her days in the town's tiny library, poring over microfilms of old newspapers and archived town records. She learned the legend was tied to a tragedy from a century ago, a man who vanished without a trace, leaving behind a heartbroken fiancé who swore his spirit would never rest until he was found. Her research became an obsession. She started staying up late, her eyes fixed on the clock, her heart pounding in anticipation as the minute hand crawled towards midnight. The first few nights, nothing happened. The house was quiet, save for the usual creaks and groans of old wood settling. She started to feel foolish, a grown woman chasing a children's ghost story. Then, on the fifth night, it happened. The clock tower chimed, its deep, resonant bells echoing through the silent town. A sudden cold snap filled her bedroom, so intense that her breath plumed in front of her. Her window, which she had firmly latched, slowly creaked open, and there, standing among the gnarled trees just beyond her garden, was a silhouette. It was tall, unnaturally so, and seemed to drink the moonlight, leaving only a void in the shape of a man. It didn't move, it just stood there, watching. Emily wasn't scared. She was electrified. It was real. From that night on, the encounters grew more frequent, more personal. The figure was no longer content to watch from the woods. One night, she awoke to the feeling of being watched, and saw it standing in the darkest corner of her bedroom. It was a pillar of absolute blackness, a distortion in the space around it. She could feel a crushing weight of sadness emanating from it, a despair so profound it felt like it was her own. She didn't scream. She whispered, "What do you want?" The figure dissolved into the shadows. Her obsession deepened. She neglected her work, ignored calls from friends and family. Her world had shrunk to the four walls of her house and the nightly visitations from her ghost. She began speaking to it, leaving out old photographs she'd found, trying to communicate, to understand its pain. The line between her own loneliness and the spirit's sorrow started to blur. She felt a strange kinship with this entity, a connection she hadn't felt with anyone living. The townsfolk started to notice the change in her. Her once bright eyes were now hollow, circled by dark rings from lack of sleep. She looked haunted, they'd say, not realizing how literally true that was. The kindly old librarian who had helped with her initial research tried to warn her. Some stories are best left undisturbed. Emily, she'd said, her voice grave. The ghost doesn't just want to be seen, it wants to be joined. Emily dismissed it as superstition. The encounters escalate. She would hear faint whispers in the static of the radio, her name spoken in a voice that sounded like rustling leaves. Objects in her house would move on their own, a teacup sliding across the table, a book falling from a shelf, always pointing her towards another clue, another piece of the century-old puzzle. The ghost was leading her, guiding her towards an answer. She followed eagerly. Her research led her to a hidden detail in the old town records. The man who had vanished was a cartographer. He was mapping the treacherous woods around Blackwood Creek when he disappeared. The journals mentioned a hidden cellar in her house, one that had been sealed up for decades. Driven by a certainty she couldn't explain, Emily took a crowbar to the old floorboards in her pantry. Beneath them, she found a narrow, stone staircase leading down into damp, musty darkness. The air was thick with the smell of earth and decay. At the bottom, in this small, cramped cellar, she found it, a skeleton clad in the tattered remains of old clothing lay half buried in the dirt floor. Beside it was a leather satchel. Inside were a set of mapping tools and a final, unfinished letter to his beloved, professing his eternal love and his fear of being lost in the woods. He was charting. He hadn't vanished in the forest. He'd been trapped here, beneath his own home, forgotten. A wave of relief and triumph washed over Emily. She had done it. She had solved the mystery. She had found him. She looked up from the skeleton, expecting the ghost to be there, expecting some sign of release, of gratitude. But the cellar remained empty and silent. She went upstairs, the letter clutched in her hand, feeling a profound sense of accomplishment. She would go to the town council in the morning. She would give this poor soul a proper burial. His story would finally be told. That night she slept more soundly than she had in months, believing her part in the story was over. But when the clock tower struck midnight, she was jolted awake by a cold that was absolute, a cold that felt like it was coming from inside her own bones. The air was heavy, suffocating. Standing at the foot of her bed was the figure, but it was different this time. It was clearer, more solid, and it wasn't just a shadow anymore. Through the darkness, she could almost make out features, hollow eyes, and a mouth open in a silent, eternal scream. The overwhelming sorrow she had felt from it before was gone. In its place was something else, something terrifying. Emptiness, a void. She finally understood. The ghost wasn't searching for its bones. It wasn't looking for peace. The legend the librarian had warned her about was true. It was looking for a replacement. It was looking for someone to share its endless, lonely watch. The figure reached out a hand, not made of flesh, but of shadow and cold. It moved slowly, deliberately, towards her face. Emily was paralyzed, not by fear, but by a sudden, horrifying realization. Her obsession hadn't been her own. The ghost had been leading her, manipulating her, using her loneliness to draw her in, to make her an accomplice in her own undoing. It had guided her to the body because finding it was the final step. The mystery was solved. The old story was over. A new one was about to begin. As the shadowy fingers touched her cheek, the cold seeped into her, and the last thing Emily saw was her own reflection in the dark, empty eyes of the ghost. And in that reflection, she saw her own face, but it was pale, translucent, her eyes filled with the same profound, eternal sorrow. The boundary had blurred. The next morning, the sun rose over Blackwood Creek. The mists cleared. In the center of town, a young woman stood by the old clock tower, motionless. Her eyes were vacant, staring at nothing. The townsfolk who passed by shivered, pulling their coats tighter, a sudden, inexplicable chill running down their spines. They didn't recognize her, this strange, sad figure who seemed to appear from nowhere. They didn't know it was Emily. They didn't know that the old house on the edge of the woods was now empty. And they didn't know that when the clock struck 12 that night, the midnight ghost would no longer be alone. Because in a town like Blackwood Creek, old stories never really end. They just find new voices to tell them, or new souls to live them.